Experiments in democratic society are enduring challenge and criticism the world over, yet democracy persists. Despite glaring imperfections that manifest as social unrest, community distress, and political crisis, the democratic ideal remains a beacon of hope and an example of resilience. This week explores the hallmark of democracy, freedom of expression, to better understand and appreciate its role in preserving and advancing democracy. Interdisciplinary and intergenerational experiences in the arts, religion, education, and recreation, Chautauqua's signature method, will guide us in this week-long celebration of diverse perspectives and aspirations for what may well be democracy's most closely held values and privileges. To begin this week, titled Freedom of Expression, Imagination, and the Resilience of Democracy, we're pleased this morning to welcome Mchangama, CEO of Justitia, a global judicial think tank founded in 2014 that focuses on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. Mr. Mchangama is also executive director of the Future of Free Speech Project, a collaboration between Justitia and Vanderbilt University, where he also serves as a research professor. Mr. Mchangama is the author of Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, which traces the ancient roots of free speech and how it spreads across the globe and connects speech controversies of the past with digital ones of the present. He has also written and commented extensively on free speech and human rights in international media outlets, including the BBC, CBS News, NPR, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. A senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Mr. Mchangama is a member of the steering committee of the Word Expression Forum and produces and narrates the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. It is our honor to host Mr. Mchangama this morning on his first visit to Chautauqua, and I want to acknowledge that we were connected to him through a recommendation from friends at the Freedom Forum, including Senior Strategic Partnerships Director Jennifer Young, who joins us at Chautauqua this week. This morning's program is made possible by the Sandra R. and R. Quintus Anderson Lectureship, making today's program the 2023 Summer Assembly's designated Chautauqua Lecture. Today's lecture is titled, The Free Speech Recession and How to Reverse It. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Jacob Mchangama.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you to all of you. It is a great honor and a privilege to be here in Chautauqua. Before I begin my lecture, I want to express my deep respect and solidarity with Salman Rushdie, who was viciously attacked on this very stage a year ago. There are few persons who better personify the importance and principle of free speech than Salman Rushdie, who has remained steadfastly committed to free speech, even for his enemies, despite living with a death sentence hanging over his head for decades. And so I'm deeply honored to be speaking at the same stage as Salman Rushdie. And I really salute Chautauqua and the Chautauqua institution for not caving in to the assassin's veto and going through with this programming. I think a lot of other institutions would have thought twice about that. And I also salute you in the audience for being here, because you demonstrate that you know that free speech is not free. It is a difficult and counterintuitive principle, and it has only been won through bloody struggles. And in fact, free speech is never truly won or lost. It is a continuing struggle, both between and within human beings. And unless we reaffirm our commitment to this principle, it will wither away under the corrosive influence of intolerance, ignorance, and indifference. But you might ask, why Why is free speech so important that we should risk our lives for what can seem like a very abstract ideal that many of us maybe have come to take for granted? And in our digitalized and polarized world, the answer to this question no longer seems self-evident. Many, even in democracies, have begun to think that the harms of free speech might outweigh the benefits. And this is true also in America. And you happen to live in a country that affords the strongest legal protection to political speech of any nation in the history of humankind. And if people are losing faith in free speech, maybe that's because many of the arguments in favor no longer seem to resonate. Now, this includes the cliché that you simply have to fight bad speech with better speech, or that the marketplace of ideas will magically sort between good and bad, between truth and lies. And the old nursery rhyme that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Now, this, of course, is wrong. Words matter, words can hurt. And I'll offer you a personal example of mine to demonstrate it. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I was walking down the streets of Copenhagen with my father. My father is an immigrant from the Comoro Islands in Africa. And at the time in Copenhagen, the area we lived in, there was a gang called the Green Jackets, a youth gang. And when we were passing some Green Jackets on the streets, one of them turned to my father and said, "Oh, I didn't know monkeys were living in our neighborhood." Now, this was not a threat. It was not incitement to violence, but it was meant to send a clear signal that because of the color of your skin, you're inferior to us, you don't belong here. My father laughed it off, but as a young boy, you can imagine it felt intimidating, and it left unpleasant memories. It hurt, like scar tissue on your prefrontal cortex. So words can definitely hurt. Even more so, words can cause real-life physical harm. So take the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Radio was absolutely instrumental. That radio was used to incite people to murder their neighbors with machetes at an unprecedented scale. And even in this country, the events of January 6th. The violent disruption of the peaceful transfer of power in the world's greatest democracy could not have taken place without words. Words that spread lies and conspiracy theories that convinced some people that they had the right to use violence. So words can cause hurt and harm. Free speech comes with harms and costs to individuals, to institutions. And this begs the question of whether free speech has been weaponized against democracy, and if so, whether governments should rein in free speech to protect democracy against the enemies of democracy, against the enemies of tolerance, against the enemies of equality. And this is where I might want to pose a question to you. How many of you think that the kind of hate speech that my father and I were subjected to on the streets of Copenhagen many years ago should be prohibited by law, by a show of hands? You're good Americans, very few, very few. You remain principled. So how many of you think that social media companies should be required by law to remove disinformation? Oh, that changes the calculus. Okay. A lot more people are concerned about that. And that, of course, would be a violation of the current speech protections in this country. So some of you seem to be in favor of the First Amendment protecting racist speech, but maybe not so much disinformation. But I'll spend the rest of this lecture trying to persuade you that free speech is the most important human right in a democracy, that the values of free speech and equality are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive, and that using censorship to protect democracy is a cure worse than the disease. And I'll try to do so by using history, lessons from history that I think can serve as an important contextualization of the current challenges that we're facing in today's polarized and digital world. But let me start off with going back some 3 decades at a much more positive time. The 90s was sort of the culmination of free speech optimism. It was the culmination of the so-called third wave of democratization, which had brought democracy and freedom to new corners of the world. Latin America, Eastern and Central Europe had seen democracy collapse. Africa had seen huge gains in democracy. And crucial to this development was free speech. And a good example of that is one of my favorite dissidents, Václav Havel, a playwright dissident in Czechoslovakia who also served as the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia. And in February 1990, he was invited to the US Congress to speak, and he spoke of his pride as speaking as a representative of a country that has set out on the road to democracy, a country where there's complete freedom of speech. And these were not mere platitudes. Months before speaking in Congress, Václav Havel had been imprisoned by the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, and he and his fellow dissidents in the Charter 77 movement had used free speech, along with many other dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, as an important way to delegitimize the communist states and to create a positive feedback loop that helped erode communism. Another iconic figure is, of course, Nelson Mandela, maybe the most famous political prisoner in history who spent some 26 years behind bars for fighting against white supremacy apartheid regime in South Africa. Now, in 1994, briefly before Nelson Mandela won the first free and multiracial presidential election in South African history, he gave a speech where he thanked the international community, international media, for using press freedom to shine a light on apartheid, on the evils of the apartheid regime, for giving a voice to anti-apartheid activists who were brutally silenced by the oppressive regime of apartheid, which really was used censorship measures that were really draconian. And Mandela, interestingly, said that no one can have a claim to a monopoly on truth, and therefore constraints on freedom of expression are a disservice to society. And then the 90s, the mid-90s, was also where the ultimate game changer arrived, the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web, the internet, was supposed to consign censorship to the ash heap of history forever. With the internet, the arrival of internet, anyone, anywhere could share anything without government or corporate control. At least that was the sort of radical ideas, techno-utopian, civil libertarian ideals that came out of Silicon Valley, and which is epitomized by the famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow in 1996. And so this was the high watermark of free speech optimism. But if we fast forward to the world we live in today, we actually now live in a free speech recession. Many of the optimistic ideals that were prevalent in the 1990s and early 2000s have played out very, very differently. So this is a statistic over the number of journalists imprisoned. And as some of you might be able to see, in 2022, 363 journalists were imprisoned across the world, which is the highest number on record since 2000, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which shows that if you're a journalist in China, Turkey, Iran, a number of other countries, you face real problems and you could very well end up in prison. You could also end up being killed and dismembered, as happened to the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which unfortunately has happened to many others. Even the internet is no longer as free as John Perry Barlow had hoped in the 1990s. So this is a map of internet freedom around the world. And what we see is that a lot of authoritarian states have reverse engineered the technology that was supposed to be liberating and turned it into instruments of mass surveillance and mass censorship. China, with its great firewall, is the best example. It exports this oppressive technology to a number of other countries around the world. Now, we should not be surprised that authoritarian and totalitarian states will do everything in their power to resist free speech. If you look up in the dictator's playbook, then on page 1, the first paragraph says that you have to control the public sphere if you want yourself, your party, to rule without the consent of the governed. I mean, that's just basic knowledge. But one of the concerning things of the current free speech recession is that democracies are contributing to it. And we see this especially in Europe, where more and more laws are being adopted to try and impose some kind of top-down control of the public sphere that many politicians feel that they have lost control of. The European Union has adopted a law which orders social media companies to remove illegal or even sometimes harmful content, whatever harmful means, within short time deadlines or risk huge fines. Now, this will obviously incentivize social media companies to remove as much content as possible, and so the real victims of this law will not be Facebook or YouTube or Google or whoever. It will be ordinary citizens who might say things that governments don't like. Another worrying tendency is that in many European countries, the restrictions on free speech are very, very different from what is allowed under the First Amendment. You really have to go out of your way in this country to be punished for political speech. I mean, it takes a lot of effort. You can really be a nasty person saying extremely nasty things and get away with it in this country. But if you happen to disagree with the COVID policies of the French government in 2020 and you took the step of comparing French President Emmanuel Macron to Hitler, which is pretty hyperbolic, but still sort of a pretty standard way to express dissent, you would get sued by President Macron and be ordered to pay 10,000 euros in a fine. Now, imagine in the years 2016 to 2020 that everyone who had compared Donald Trump to Hitler could be successfully sued by Donald Trump. The courts would be swamped in this country, and I think everyone would recognize that that would not be consistent with free speech ideals. Another very concerning development that is ongoing right now, as we speak, is that liberal, progressive states in Scandinavia, where I'm from, are now bowing to pressure from very authoritarian states. Some of you might remember back in 2005, a Danish newspaper published cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. How many of you remember that? All of you, good. At the time, that unleashed what you might call a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion. And Denmark, a small country of less than 6 million people, came under intense pressure, diplomatic pressure, terrorist attacks. We're still living with the consequences today. But the Danish government refused to back down, said, in Denmark, you're free to criticize religion, even if offensive, and we cannot tell newspapers what they can publish. But today, after months of some pretty loathsome far-right activists who burned Korans in both Copenhagen and Stockholm, pressure has again been brought to bear on Denmark and Sweden by countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey, as well as terrorist threats. And now the message is very different. The Danish government has announced that it will adopt some kind of law which will prohibit insulting the religions and cultures of foreign states. Okay. And most people are instinctively against those who burn the Qurans, because book burnings have a pretty dark history. It's a very primitive way to express dissent, and it's a pretty poor substitute for reasoned debate. However, these kinds of laws are also likely to target, for instance, Iranian women who fled the theocratic regime of Iran and who protest the oppression of women in Iran due to its religious laws and its interpretation of the Quran. And remember that Iran is the very state that issued a fatwa, a death sentence against Salman Rushdie. The very reason Rushdie was attacked on this stage was because of the fatwa by Iran. And right now, Iran is among states that are dictating the limits of free speech in a secular liberal country like Denmark. I have to say that I'm deeply ashamed of what the Danish government is contemplating. Okay, what about the US? Well, as I said, the US enjoys the strongest legal protection of free speech in human history. But the underlying culture of free speech in the US is arguably eroding due to this particular moment of time where tribalism and political polarization is so intense. So ask Americans whether they support free speech, and everyone will say yes. But then ask them, as I just did, you see that the commitment to principle sometimes tends to collapse along partisan lines. And you see this in various ways. So for instance, there's been a great uptick in the number of scholars at colleges and universities who are being sanctioned or attempted to be sanctioned due to their words, whether in or outside of the classroom. So actually, we've seen more cases of scholars being sanctioned than people who were sanctioned, targeted during the second Red Scare under McCarthyism, which I think is a pretty significant stat. And scholars also worry more about, they self-censor more than they did at that time in American history. The flip side of that is that in Republican-dominated states, conservatives use state power to fight back against wokeism and critical race theory. So I recently moved to Tennessee. Anyone from Tennessee here? Okay, a few. Now, I love Tennessee, nicest people on earth, but recently the Tennessee legislature adopted a bill aimed at prohibiting public drag shows, which is classical red meat culture war stuff. And we've seen an increase in the number of laws and examples where books on LGBT content, on racial history are being pulled from libraries. Florida, under Governor Ron DeSantis, has become sort of a figurehead of legal warfare against quote-unquote woke ideas. And so what you see in America is what I call Milton's curse. Most of you are probably familiar with John Milton, the English poet who wrote the Areopagitica back in the 1640s. Now, the Areopagitica is a very eloquent defense of press freedom and a strong criticism against pre-publication censorship. It still resonates today, but read it more closely and you see that John Milton was in favor of press freedom, but not for Catholics. Not for Unitarians, and not really for anyone who, had too crazy ideas. In fact, press freedom for John Milton was mostly for mainline Protestant sects to hash out their differences in peace. And the tragedy of John Milton is that he ended up serving as a censor under Cromwell's military dictatorship. And so Milton's curse is this all too human impulse to be in favor of free speech, but not for the others. only for me and my ideas and those I sort of feel comfortable in tolerating. And human beings are exceptionally good at rationalizing Milton's curse, at explaining to themselves, convincing themselves why free speech is really, really important, but only for these ideas that I accept and not for others, and why actually it is crucial to free speech that we banish those ideas. And that, I think, is a danger to this country. And we have, unfortunately, a good example. So the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. But 7 years later, this young republic faced its first sort of real test when it came to free speech. So the Alien and Seditions Act was passed under the Adams administration. And so suddenly you had founders who had been brothers in arms, who'd shared philosophical ideals, being completely opposed to each other. So you had, federalists like Adams, Hamilton, and even, in the background, Washington, squaring off against Madison, the architect of the First Amendment, and Jefferson. And the Sedition Act basically said that if you criticized the president, the government, or Congress, you go to jail. And a lot of Americans were prosecuted. So journalists went to prison. Even a congressman went to prison. And so it was a fight over first principles. And it's remarkable that the founding generation could come to blows over the principle of free speech, which had been really a rallying cry during the Revolutionary War, where everyone was in agreement that free speech was the bulwark of liberty. And my fear, of course, is that if the cultural underpinnings of free speech erodes in this country, you might go back to those days. And of course, the Sedition Act was not the last time free speech was eroded in this country. If you go back 100 years, if you were a socialist or an anarchist and you expressed opposition to American participation in World War I, you could go to jail for 10 or 20 years, and the Supreme Court would say, well, that's not protected by the First Amendment. And we'll get back to how the First Amendment got beefed up in its protection. But if you accept my argument that free speech is suffering a recession, we might, even in democracies, we should ask ourselves, why is it? And I think there are a number, I can't give you an exhaustive overview, but I'll delve into some of the main reasons, at least as I see them. One of them is what I call elite panic. So here we have two quotes from President Obama. One of them was when he was a junior senator from Illinois back in 2006. And he praised the internet because it allowed him to say what he wanted without censorship. And perhaps no one has used the internet and social media to more better effect than Obama when he won the Facebook generation, becoming part that was instrumental in winning him the presidency. He resonated with younger voters, a lot of people who were put off by traditional politics. He upended the traditional gatekeepers of the Democratic Party and catapulted him into the presidency. But after the fallout of the 2020 presidential election, Obama now said that the very platforms that had helped him win the presidency was now the biggest threat against democracy in this country. A lot of you seem to agree. And this dynamic was not something that was new with Obama. We have to go all the way back to the origins of free speech to understand this dynamic. So we'll just rewind history 2,500 years to the Athenian democracy. Big jump from Obama, but bear with me. So the Athenian democracy was a direct democracy, and it had two overlapping concepts of free speech. One of them was isagoria, meaning equality of speech. So every freeborn male citizen participated directly in democracy. They had the right to speak and vote on laws and matters of public affairs in the ecclesia, the assembly, looking a little bit like this in Athens. No matter whether you were poor, learned or not, everyone, at least in principle, had the right to speak on politics. But they also had another overlapping concept called parousia, meaning uninhibited speech. This was a civic commitment to the tolerance of different ideas. And it was what allowed philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who were quite critical of democracy, to set up shop in Athens. And for a number of decades, it even allowed Socrates to accost his citizens in the agora, in the marketplace of Athens, until the Athenians were struck by Milton's curse and reneged on their own values, and Socrates paid the price. So the underpinnings of Athenian free speech was its egalitarian nature. Now we have to contrast this with free speech in the Roman Republic. Free speech in the Roman Republic was the opposite of the Athenian. It was top-down elitist. So it was to be exercised by the wealthy, learned, powerful men in the Senate, people like Cicero and Cato, but not the unwashed mob who were too fickle, ignorant, and dangerous to allow a voice in public affairs. So unlike the Athenian assemblies in Rome, ordinary citizens did not have a right to speak. And if the plebs said something against their betters, it was seen as licentiousness, which was outside the scope of free speech. And ever since, throughout history, we see tension between the egalitarian and elitist conception of free speech. And so elite panic breaks out every time the public sphere is expanded, either through communication technology, the printing press is a prime example, or when previously marginalized and silenced groups are demanding a voice in public affairs, whether religious minorities, racial minorities, women, the poor and the propertyless, and so on. And let me give you some examples. So many of you probably know Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great humanist scholar of the 16th century. Very few people have been as productive, have written as much as Erasmus did. But in 1525, you can see that Erasmus has had enough. Too much is being written, too much is being printed on these new printing presses, and he feels that printers fill the world with pamphlets and books that are foolish, ignorant, malignant, libelous, mad, impious, and subversive. Today we think of the printing press and books as the epitome of highbrow culture, dedication to intellectual ideals, but Erasmus had had enough. And why did he have enough? Because he was living through a very tumultuous time in European history. Martin Luther, an honorary German monk, had used the printing press to devastating effect to spread his Reformation, and that Reformation upended political and religious authority in Europe. And so the traditional gatekeepers, including the Catholic Church, were not too happy about that. They could no longer control what was being said, how religion was interpreted, because Martin Luther insisted on writing in German rather than Latin, writing sort of punchy, short treatises addressed to the ordinary person, writing, publishing cartoons and memes depicting cardinals and the popes as devils, the same way that we have memes online today. But jump forward 3 centuries, and even the New York Times had misgivings about new communications technology. So the transatlantic telegraph suddenly meant that news could be transmitted between Europe and America in a matter of seconds or minutes. And this did not please the New York Times, which wrote that so far as the influence of the newspaper upon the mind and morals of the people is concerned, there can be no rational doubt that the telegraph has caused vast injury. Superficial, sudden, unsifted, too fast for the truth must be all telegraphic intelligence. Now, why do you need to know what's going on in Europe in a couple of seconds when you can just wait 2 or 3 weeks? If you change the words telegraph and put in social media today, you could basically see 100,000 op-eds written in traditional media about the dangerous effects of social media today. So these are good examples of what I call elite panic. But just because elite panic has been used to fret about new communications technology and to keep the voiceless and powerless down, does not mean that elite panic cannot be caused by genuine concerns. And again, I think January 6th is a is a good example of an event where elite panic was warranted. You know, the uncontrollable spread of lies and conspiracy theories that led to the attack on the peaceful transfer of power. So you might say, well, okay, free speech is important, elite panic we need to be cautious about, but when those who want to use free speech to overthrow democracy, to overthrow democratic values, there we have to put the foot down. There has to be limits about that. And this is one of the main reasons why Europe has laws that are much more speech restrictive than the US. It's this idea in Europe that the Nazis' rise to power through democratic means shows that democracies must be militant. They cannot just sit on their hands when the enemies of democracy and tolerance are gathering in the streets, when they are writing their things and using free speech to destroy free speech and democracy. And there have been some really powerful arguments in favor of that viewpoint. One of them being Karl Popper, the Austrian political philosopher who wrote his seminal work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, as an emigre from the Third Reich in New Zealand. And he coined the so-called paradox of tolerance, which says that if a tolerant society wants to survive, it has to be intolerant of the intolerant. It has to be willing to use force to defend itself. Another interesting person is Robert H. Jackson, a person who has connections to Chautauqua, but who also served as Chief Justice, not Chief Justice, but as a Supreme Court Justice on the Supreme Court. And even more interestingly, Jackson served as the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, where he prosecuted German war criminals, including some who were prosecuted for their speech, like Julius Streicher, the editor of the Nazi rag Das Stürmer, who was executed for incitement to genocide. And in a case, Terminiello versus Chicago, which was basically about this fascist priest who had some pretty feisty rhetoric, and whose speech was heckled by a violent mob, and the priest was then fined for disorderly conduct. And the Supreme Court majority said, well, you know, we can't allow the heckler's veto to win, so even if you have unpopular views, we can't allow counter-protesters to violently disrupt you and then fine the person who does nothing more than speak. But Jackson was not convinced. So he said that, you know, such a rigid conception of free speech risks turning the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution into a suicide pact. The flaw in this kind of argument, from my point of view, is that when you look at what happened in the Weimar Republic, the short-lived Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933 in Germany, was that there was actually a lot of censorship there. The Weimar Republic tried to defend its democracy through ever more restrictive speech restrictions, censorship, emergency laws. So Hitler himself was banned from speaking in a number of German states for a while. Goebbels, who would later become propaganda minister, founded a newspaper called Der Angriff, or The Attack, and he boasted that this was the most frequently censored newspaper in Germany, because the state was allowed administratively to ban newspapers that spread false information, that attack government officials, and so on. And Julius Streicher himself, the editor of the Stürmer, at a time when it did not explicitly call for genocide, was convicted and sent to prison for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and blood libels. But he was greeted as a martyr by his supporters. And shortly after his last conviction in Nuremberg, the Nazis won a resounding victory in the polls there. The radio was also censored. Neither communists nor Nazis were allowed on the airwaves. But perhaps the biggest flaw in the idea of militant democracy is that ultimately the Nazis used the very laws that were supposed to protect democracy to abolish it. So the the Weimar Constitution said that the president in a time of emergency could suspend all civil liberties, including free speech. So after the Reichstag fire in Berlin, Adolf Hitler, as chancellor, convinces President Hindenburg to say, you now have to suspend all these liberties because communists are such a threat to the state that we have to crack down on them. And so the Weimar emergency laws that were supposed to protect democracy provided legitimacy to the Nazis to do away with freedom of speech for all but themselves and create a totalitarian one-party system. So this is why I respectfully disagree with the idea of militant democracy. Another well-intentioned an important argument in favor of restricting free speech is this idea that free speech has become weaponized against minorities. It entrenches unequal power relations. It has become an instrument of the powerful, of the majority against minorities. And so in order to ensure the dignity of minorities, we have to limit what can be said. Like me and my father on the streets of Copenhagen. But again, I think that history shows that this argument is fundamentally wrong. In fact, I would go so far as to say that free speech is the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has ever invented. And I think American history bears this out. So let's go back to the 1830s. Abolitionists in the North start a campaign sending petitions, pamphlets, and so on by mail to the South, arguing for the abolition of slavery. And what happens is not that Southerners engage in recent debate, maybe because defending slavery in a country with the Constitution that this country has is pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult to win that argument. You basically have to be willing to engage in gross hypocrisy. So instead, Southern states adopted probably the most speech restrictive laws in the history of America. My favorite example, favorite in quotation mark, is from Virginia. Now remember, Virginia, even before the Declaration of Independence, adopted a Bill of Rights in June 1776, which said that press freedom is the bulwark of liberty. It can only be restricted by despotic governments. Virginia is the home state of Madison, the architect of the First Amendment, of Jefferson. But in 1836, the General Assembly in Virginia adopted a law which said that anyone entering the state and advocating for the abolition of slavery, anyone entering the state saying that white slave owners did not have a right to property in the human beings that they had enslaved, could go to jail for up to 6 months. Now, there were other states that, at least on paper, had a death penalty for abolitionists. I don't know that anyone was actually executed, but there's certainly a number of people who were imprisoned, prosecuted, hounded out of state for expressing their opposition to slavery. On the other side, you had abolitionists themselves, and abolitionists who used the practice and principle of free speech as their most important weapon against slavery. And no one, in my opinion, did so more effectively than the great Frederick Douglass, who spent a lot of his life not far from here in Rochester, and as a non-American, I'm allowed to say that, is, in my opinion, the greatest American who ever lived, at least that I'm aware of. And when you read Frederick Douglass's speeches and about his life, free speech is just a central theme, like using the word is such a central theme in his life. But there's one particular event which I think is worth highlighting. So in 1860, an abolitionist meeting was supposed to take place at the Tremont Temple in Boston, And Frederick Douglass obviously was supposed to speak. But the meeting was violently disrupted by white Bostonians who were concerned about the dissolution of the Union, about their commercial interests. And so the meeting could not go ahead. And this caused Frederick Douglass to write what I still think is probably the best short defense of free speech ever written, called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston. And if I had the time, I would just read it out, because the entire piece is one long, juicy quote that really responds to all the controversies that we're still discussing today. But I've taken just this quote, which talks to Douglass's principled universalist view of free speech, where he says, "A man's right to speak does not depend upon where he was born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and there let it rest forever." And it's clear to Douglass on other occasions said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. So to Douglass, free speech had enormous emancipatory power. It was a formidable weapon against slavery, against white supremacy. Whereas for white supremacists, for slaveholders, censorship and suppression was the natural order of things. Of course, the end of slavery was not the end of white supremacy in this country. But again, the civil rights movement played a pivotal role in developing the First Amendment to give it the teeth that it has today, especially from the 50s, late 50s and the 60s. At a time, if you go to sort of the 40s and 50s, in the US, you could go to jail if you were a member of the Socialist Party. So it did not afford the kind of speech protection that is afforded today. And as I said, the civil rights movement is a big reason why you have such a strong protection of free speech today. And one of my favorite cases is Edwards versus South Carolina from 1963. So you have 180 or so students who peacefully protest at the Capitol in South Carolina, singing songs in protest demanding equality. Now, city officials say, you have to break up this protest because we're concerned that white citizens will respond with violence. So we have the same situation as in Terminiello, the case where Robert H. Jackson said that, allowing someone to speak that will invite violence from those who disagree is too rigid a conception of free speech. It will be a suicide pact. But in this case, the Supreme Court relied on Terminiello. It relied on a case that had protected the right of a fascist-friendly, racist speech to protect the rights of a persecuted minority to speak truth to power and demand equality in the face of opposition from both citizens, other citizens, hostile to them, and government officials. So a powerful example of how principle can serve the interests of those who are oppressed. I think that the late Congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis, when he looked back at his glorious career, said it better than anyone else. Lewis, who was once arrested, I think in Dallas, for protesting with a sign that said, "One man, one vote," said that without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And this is not purely an American history. I don't know of any movement fighting for justice and equality that has not relied on the practice and principle of free speech to advance their cause. After all, how do you shine a light on oppression if not through speech, petition, appealing to your to citizens, to the wider community? How do you do that? So whether it's the women's rights movement, LGBT movement, anti-colonial movement like Gandhi in India, all of them, and I've pointed to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, all of them have hailed the principle of free speech and has been instrumental to their struggles. And this brings me back to my father. So by 2015, he had moved back to the Comoro Islands in Africa and become a member of civil society who often protested the corrupt and inefficient government of that island nation. And in 2015, he organized a strike against this corrupt government that could not provide basic services to its citizens. And so finally, the government had enough, and they arrested him and put him in prison for a few days. And what was the charge? Incitement to hatred. So the very charge that some would think should have protected me and my father against racism could be used by an authoritarian state to justify their crackdown on dissent. And this is why I believe that minorities do themselves a disservice if they argue for restrictions on free speech. If you're a minority, you're only ever a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of laws against hatred and offense. And so you're playing a very dangerous game. Finally, it might be sort of worth asking, so where do we go from now? If you agree with me that we live in a free speech recession, what is the way forward? How do we reaffirm our commitment to this principle? And I would say that the most critical component of ensuring resilient, flourishing free speech in the 21st century is a culture of free speech. And what do I mean by a culture of free speech? It means that the value of free speech has to live in our hearts and also in our acts, our interactions with each other. We have to recognize that free speech is the antithesis of violence, really. You know, we live in a world where we can be neighbors, spouses, colleagues, friends with people who have very different ideas from ourselves about politics, religion, and philosophy. But we don't typically go to war with each other. We don't kill each other. And why is that? That's because free speech and tolerance are two sides of the same coin. But all too often, we now hear the call that tolerance demands censorship. That it demands that we restrict certain viewpoints. But to impose silence and call it tolerance does not make it so, because real tolerance requires understanding. Understanding comes from listening, and listening presupposes speech. So let me end with a quote from the great George Orwell, if I can. Who said that if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. If public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient, minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. So I hope that you will be bearers of a vibrant culture of free speech, and that you will use free speech as well as tolerance, and that you will react to those who disagree with you with interest, overbearance, and engage in debate. I think that is the safest way to ensure the survival and flourishing of free speech. And while free speech is a difficult and counterintuitive example, I think that history, both in this country and elsewhere in the world, shows that the cost of not having free speech is one that will ultimately be made up in blood and persecution. Thank you very much for your attendance.
We know some of you use this time as we transition to Q&A to move on to other activities at Chautauqua, and if that is you, we ask that you do so quietly. For those staying behind, we ask that you remain fairly quiet as well as we transition to Q&A. You can submit questions to our ushers who are circulating with slips of paper and pencils, and you're also welcome to use our questions portal at questions.chq.org. Jakob, thank you for that stirring defense of free speech. Tons of questions have already come in, and I wanted to start in a spot where when we were conceiving of this week at Chautauqua, the original conception of the title was Freedom of Expression and the Resilience of Democracy, and a colleague wanted to add imagination in there. And at first I thought, well, expression covers that, but I've come to think of it, there being a distinction there. What distinction do you draw between freedom of expression or speech and freedom of imagination, and why is that important to defend?
Well, imagination is part of freedom of thought, really, but we need freedom of speech and expression to give voice to our imagination, and only through our imagination expressing it can we, try to come up with ideas and solutions and solve the challenges that we face. For a lot of the values and institutions that we take for granted today were beyond the imagination of people previously. It was if you were a Puritan arriving in America in the 17th century, it was beyond your imagination to conceive of religious freedom. You might have left England because you thought you were being persecuted, but you were not about to set up a colony in New England to provide religious freedom to crazy papists and others who, and you were perfectly happy to use brutal punishments. If you lived in the South in the 18th century, it was not part of your imagination that black people should have equal rights, or that they should not be able to be owned as chattel property. So we need people who can imagine those alternatives to voice their ideas, and that's the intimate relationship, I think, between imagination and freedom of expression.
Thank you. We have a number of people who are referencing Justice Holmes back in 1918, making a distinction of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And many folks, I think, are defending their raised hand, saying, isn't what happens on social media akin to that, especially when it comes to incitements of violence or what our young people are experiencing online?
So I have to admit, I hope I don't offend you, but I think that is the worst defense of free speech. First of all, this is a case which is no longer the law of the land, and it was used in a case that justified the conviction of Jewish radical peace activists who distributed pamphlets opposing American involvement in World War I. So when you're using that particular trope, I would almost call it, you're actually referencing a case that has been overturned, and one where I think 99.999%, if not all of us, would agree that that case was decided wrongly. So the current standard in such cases is the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, from 1969, and that indeed was shows the radical nature of American free speech protections when it comes to political speech. So that was basically a local member of the KKK in Ohio who was standing before rolling TV cameras and saying not so nice things about black people and Jews and what he thought should be done to them if they weren't kept in line. But the Supreme Court developed a new test there, so you basically have to engage in inciting imminent violence that is also likely to occur. That's sort of not the exact wording of the test. And it's interesting to note that one of the justices in that case was Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African American on the Supreme Court, and who was responsible for many of the landmark victories, or at least contributed to them, that expanded free expression. I think that his understanding of free speech was very much one that said minorities are absolutely dependent on a principled, consistent defense of free speech, protection of free speech to secure their rights. And that means that you have to allow even white supremacists to voice their opinions, as long as they don't do it in a manner that is likely to, for instance, that is very likely and intended to result in violence. Now, obviously, today's digital sphere does raise new questions, and I think all the debates we've had about social media are about to pale in comparison with debates we'll have about generative AI. It'll be much more difficult to talk about content moderation and disinformation in that sphere. But I think that the solutions that we have to adopt will need free speech as a core component of it. My own organization, we're working on these toolkits, for instance, which will allow and empower minorities, civil society organizations to engage in counter-speech, using AI to amplify the voices of those who push back against hate speech, push back against disinformation. So those are non-restrictive ways to try and counter the harms of free speech, rather than providing the government with powers to do so. That will almost inevitably be used to silence inconvenient minorities, as Orwell said.
Problems with disinformation on social media isn't just the words, but the algorithms that choose by whom and when they are seen. Do you favor an adjustment in that mechanic?
I think that, first of all, I think that it's really important to take so for instance, some of the stories surrounding the 2016 presidential election basically said, well, Russian disinformation decided the outcome of the election, which I think has been pretty robustly rebutted by the subsequent data. Now, that does not mean that dis and misinformation does not pose a challenge to democracy, because one effect could be that not so much that it convinces people of falsehoods. I think it's really difficult to convince people who are not already partisans. If you were a huge Hillary Clinton supporter, you're unlikely to be swayed by Russian disinformation. So disinformation works best with those who are already partisans. But disinformation could result in an environment where people get apathetic and no longer sort of trust anything. And I think that might be the biggest danger. But I think, again, disinformation and misinformation is most dangerous when there's a lack of trust in institutions, in democracy, in traditional media. So I think I would start there. I would start on how do we rebuild trust in this society? I mean, trust in America has collapsed. And I think that's the real issue. Now, disinformation may contribute to that, but the collapse in trust predates social media. So that is, probably a much bigger and more difficult question, rather than sort of to argue, oh, we can just ban disinformation. But then who gets to decide what is disinformation? Is a Biden administration and a Trump administration likely to have the same definition of disinformation? Probably not. And those who will be end up on the sharp end of the law will probably differ quite a bit. So I think there are many things that we can do to fight disinformation that does not depend on restricting free speech.
Can you comment on the impact of the recent police raid on the Marion County Record in Kansas? What does that portend for free speech by journalists?
Yeah, so I just saw the headlines of it. It seemed to me very draconian and something more likely to happen in Russia than the US. Hopefully there'll be legal consequences for those who authorized it and those who carried it out, because I'm assuming that lawyers are already working on the case, and that the First Amendment will have a big say in litigating that controversy. But it certainly did not look good, even though I haven't studied it in detail.
Someone asking you to become a revisionist historian. If there was complete freedom of speech in Germany before 1933, would this have affected the political success of Hitler? Would he not have succeeded?
No. As I make perfectly clear in my book, I think that the relationship between free speech and censorship in the Weimar Republic was certainly not the main factor in the collapse of democracy and the rise of Nazism. There's a background of World War I. There's a background with the Wall Street crash and the effects on the German economy, and the fact that a lot of people in Germany were just not very strongly in favor of democracy, and a lot of people on the right saw communism as a bigger threat than Nazism, and then were willing to support Nazis as a fortress against that. So I'm not arguing that we can understand the rise of Nazism through the prism of the relationship between free speech and Nazism. I'm simply responding to the argument that a lot of people made that democracies have to be militant, because if they censor totalitarian movements, they will avoid totalitarianism. That argument, to me, does not seem to be borne out. However, I will say that while the Weimar Republic cracked down on a lot of speech, it was also very impotent when it came to cracking down on violence. And I think this is something that is critical. Like, if you have non-state actors marching around in uniforms in the street, violently intimidating people, this is something where the state has to put its foot down. That is not free speech. That is intimidation. And that's where I think the Weimar Republic failed miserably in that it failed to sort of keep the peace. And also the courts were very lenient against political violence, especially political violence on the right.
This is a provocative question, but I'll ask you to maybe dive in a little deeper on what you just mentioned about artificial intelligence. But this questioner asks, does artificial intelligence deserve free speech?
So there's a huge debate, and I'm really not qualified to talk, to delve in, but whether, do current AI systems, are they conscious or not? I don't know. And a lot of researchers don't know. My intuition right now would be that they're not. But if they are at some point, it might be relevant. But I think the larger question here is, free speech is not only about the right of the individual. Free speech is also about, really a collective right of access to information. And there's no doubt that AI systems can facilitate the access to information profoundly. And so when you integrate AI systems with search functions, for instance, you have knowledge at your fingertips that the most renowned scholars not long ago could only dream of. So in that sense, it's not only about the right of the AI system, but also about our right. Should we, due to the potential dangers of AI systems, should the government be allowed to impose restrictions? Well, that might interfere not with the right to free speech of the AI system, but of the right of everyone in this room to be able to access information, which I think is also a critical right, and something that Frederick Douglass also talked about a lot. But I think AI is really something that raises profound questions that we don't really about how will the concept of free expression be understood as we go forward, and I certainly don't have clear answers, and it seems to me that most people who work in the field don't either. So I'm happy to revise my opinions on this, in 5 years. If you invite me back, we can have a conversation.
Chautauqua, please help me thank Jacob Mchangama.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua institutions' full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.